So I find these days that when I read an academic article from, say, an historian or a philosopher, actually I don't read philosophers, from historians in Vietnam, I can get through that article in about 10 seconds, 20 seconds. The title indicates to me that it's a topic that someone has talked about over and over and over again. You start scrolling through, you find that there's just nothing new done. 20 seconds of your life wasted. There's nothing there to think about, to learn from, to appreciate. In reading the articles of the South Vietnamese philosopher Kim Định, however, I have the exact opposite experience. With an article by Kim Định, I've got to spend like a week on this thing because he's referring to debates that were going on in the Western world of philosophy in the 20th century that I'm not familiar with. He makes reference to the I Ching. He makes reference to current events at that time. There's all this stuff that's packed in there. And then he has his own theorizations. They're just dense with information and in ideas. And are a total contrast to the kind of superficial, shallow scholarship that so permeates our societies today. And so it's been so liberating to read some of this scholarship by Kim Định, because the one thing I've heard from people today is like, oh, he's just this kind of extreme nationalist. Okay, some of his ideas ended up in that place, but the place where he started was far more sophisticated and intelligent and interesting than anything, as far as I can tell, that's getting written today. He's just a fascinating, fascinating individual. And one of the things that I was particularly fascinated to find is that some of the inspiration for his ideas ultimately have their roots right here in Honolulu in 1949. So the University of Hawaii might not be the pearl of the Pacific that it once was, but there is a tradition here of engaging in an intellectual debate between the East and the West. In this day and age, I think that's a dichotomy we shouldn't be talking about. But if we go back in time 70 years or so, this was the way that people viewed the world. And from the perspective of this little island in the middle of the Pacific, there were scholars here who felt that they seriously needed to engage with that side of the world to try to understand and to try to move our understanding of humankind forward. One of the ways they did that was by holding conferences. And there was a professor in the philosophy department at the University of Hawaii by the name of Charles Moore, who held a conference in 1939 on East/West or East-West philosophy, and then a decade later held another conference on East-West philosophy. And this is a conference that Kim Định was aware of and made reference to in his writings. Because one of the things that the philosophers at this conference did was to try to create some kind of synthesis, or to see if it was possible to create a synthesis between the ideas of the East and the West. What Charles Moore said in his introduction to the conference volume was that some members of the conference may have hoped that their deliberations would eventually produce a single homogeneous world philosophy, but such hopes were destined to be unfilled. So a universal homogeneous world philosophy was not created here in Honolulu, but the idea that Kim Định was particularly influenced by was one kind of possibility that was held out to scholars. And that was this idea of seeking an quote-unquote orchestrated unity, providing a synthesis which would be broad enough and flexible enough to include the rich and variegated perspectives of the several philosophical traditions without doing violence to any blah, blah, blah. We're getting too philosophical here. But this idea of an orchestrated unity is something that I can see clearly influence Gimdeen's writings. And I love this idea of orchestrated unity, and I can see how Gimdeen liked it. An orchestra is something that harmonizes different parts together, horns, strings, drums, but something that is orchestrated is also created, it's manufactured, it's invented, and that is clearly what Gimdeen felt that needed to be done in Vietnam in the 1950s and 1960s. So at the beginning of an article that Gimdeen wrote in like 1960 or 1961 on Hon Zundup, the soul of the people or the soul of the nation, what he argued or what he noted was that there were these scholars in the West such as Arnold Toynbee and Oswald Spengler who had talked about civilization. What Spengler had said is that civilization is this kind of outward manifestation of a culture, and that civilizations become kind of stiff and eventually die, but this core that inspired them can still exist. Toynbee, on the other hand, said that civilizations were created by a kind of creative minority who at certain points of time realized that there were problems that were not being solved, and they offered solutions that enabled a group of people to solve those problems. By doing so, they created a civilization, but later in time, when other people couldn't maintain that creativity, the civilization ultimately died. Well, what is clear is that what Gimdeen felt was that by the 1950s or 1960s in Vietnam, the civilization that existed there was dead, and that what you needed was this kind of creative minority who would come up with new ideas to solve the problems of the day. But in doing so, they could move beyond the civilization that existed before that time and look into the culture, this sort of core that had been there earlier, to try to find things to bring out, to mix with the present. And here, Gimdeen got pretty far out. He came up with these kind of diagrams and things like this, where basically he said, like, this is the ideas of the past when they were matched with the kind of the social conventions of the Gu, or old society. They created one kind of civilization, I guess we could say. But what you needed to do in the present was to take certain values of the past, to mix them with the changing society of the modern era to create something new. And this is what he felt his mission was. In doing this, he looked to the past, he got terms that he appropriated from there to try to have things make sense. And so, for instance, he gave the name of Damtian, or the three heavens, to this concept of the values that existed there in the past. He called the Dodia, or the four earths, as a concept that referred to the changing social dynamics of certain eras. And what he ultimately argued was that people needed to be very jumtang. They needed to be honest or devoted to the values of the past, but they needed to zaifeng. They need to liberate the dodia, the social conventions of the present. So this is very interesting, because for many years before the time of Gimdeen in East Asia, and particularly in China, there had been this idea that the West provides technology and the East provides morality. What Gimdeen was saying, though, is something different. He's saying, yes, there is important elements of morality in the East, but that morality isn't static. It has to change because the social dynamics of society have changed through the contact with the West. So we can't look to ancient times to find out how men and women should relate to each other, for instance, when the way that they relate today is obviously very different due to the fact that they've come in contact with the ways that the Western world, women and men in the Western worlds interact. So the thing that Gimdin was really focusing on was that people needed to invent something new, and that is what is fascinating. He gave this example that the way to move forward is to think of it in terms of music. People need to study Western music, harmony, counterpoint, and all these other things. They need to study traditional Vietnamese music, the gazao, the folk singing, and all these other things. And then from a kind of intelligent thinking through all of this stuff that's out there, to mean to invent something new and to move forward and to create something that can really relate to something deep inside of people, or what he called the soul of the people, Hon Zandop. This is incredibly interesting because Gimdin is writing this at a time when so many people are just being plainly nationalistic and taking nationalism as a given. What Gimdin is doing is to take a step back from that. He's very kind of self-reflexive. He understands that things like nationalism, that nationalism is something that is created. And so what he's trying to say is, yes, we're going to create something, but we're going to create something significant because we're going to do it in an intelligent manner, and we're going to dig deeply, and we're going to mix that not just with the technology of the West, but with the societal changes, the societal changes that have taken place through contact with the West as well. This guy was damn smart. And the more I read of this guy, the more impressed I am. There are other people out there who are smart, but this guy was damn smart. Texture, point 1.